This morning we were able to bring people with different ways of thinking about the world or sensing the world into conversation. This afternoon, what we want to do is give you a series of activity and progress. Yesterday, Agustina Barnes talked about the challenge of moving from maybe something like research through to delivery. And so, what better way to start than with Cormac Russell, founding director of Nurture Development and an expert in asset-based community development. Cormac, I would love to welcome you to the stage.
Good afternoon, both on land and online. I guess we can be both. Good to be there. We have about 20 minutes to be in each other's company, so I thought what I'd try to do is keep this pretty story-based. And Dominic has invited me to talk about development, which is one of these terms which was quite new in 1949 when Truman started, fantasizing that America might be able to develop the world. And anybody watching the news today can see where that's all coming to pass. So development is a kind of a contested term. But what I wanted today to suggest is there are two stories that are alive in the world when we think about development, particularly community development. And I guess one is one that I want to suggest that really has come to the end of its sell-by date. But the only way you can really replace stories is to honor what's good about the existing ones and then evolve at some level and create some kind of growth around the edges of that. So I think story one around development was basically this idea that we would take institutions which were typically hierarchical, and those institutions would try to work with what they perceived to be the needs of individuals or communities. So the way that was done was an institution would do a needs analysis of a sort. And over the course of history and mental health and physical health and whatnot, for a long time that was quite medicalized. So the idea was you'd find a pathology in an individual and then you'd do something to them to fix them so that their body would work to whatever standard we thought bodies should work and that their brains would operate to whatever standards we thought they should work. And as that started proving not to actually be such a good idea, like all systems, they don't give in easy. So then they said, well, maybe the problem is not so much that there's something not right about the way we're thinking about development. The system said, well, maybe the problem is that we're not being integrated enough. So they introduced a new idea, it's kind of a version of partnership and interagency working. They said, well, instead of going at individuals and communities with one institution, how about we try to go at them with multiple institutions, right? So they created this wraparound, no wrong door, kind of seamless, coordinated way of working. And they thought, well, that's going to work. If we can have an institution that addresses housing, that addresses mental health, that addresses prison, that, if they just all worked together, that would work. And it was a very plausible idea, actually, because it was true to say that a lot of these institutions still, even to this day, work in silos. As we all know, silos are where smart people go to do silly things, right? But the difficulty was, just by surrounding people with lots of institutions, things didn't get better. Because the story, if you break it down into its simplest terms, says your well-being is in the hands of a doctor. Your child's education is in the ability of the teacher and in the arena of the classroom. Your judicial well-being outcomes, your justice outcomes, happen in prisons or in a courtroom. And even a moment's thought would say, well, that just doesn't actually add up. It's partially true, but it's not the whole story. So there were things that were missing in this version of development. One of the first things that was missing was this idea that the person at the center isn't just a problem to be fixed. That they're not their pathology or whatever version of somebody else's diagnosis of their pathology might be, that they're a human being. And that if you wanted to label them, then label them as gifted, instead of thinking of them as at risk, thinking of them as at promise. So, let's see if we can do something about this picture, make it a little bit better. So, I don't want to get rid of institutions because we need them. I don't fancy my neighbours performing heart surgery on me if I have angina, so that's not what I'm trying to say here. But what I am trying to say is if we're missing parts of the puzzle, we should have, I suppose, the generosity and the grace to include them. So here I want to add to the development story that whoever we're getting alongside and serving is not a problem to be fixed or a passive recipient of our service, but as somebody fundamentally as a human being with gifts, with contributions that are absolutely irreplaceable. And that's not just voice and choice, they're important, but also that they're creators, that they're makers, that they're doers, that mental health is not something that is done to us. Development is not something that's done to us. It's often done by us and with us, and yes, sometimes for us, but it's never done to us. The other thing that's missing in that first story, and I guess we're evolving now into story 2, is this idea that people are not on their own. So development isn't just a story about how we get institutions and services to line up better with people who are patients. That in fact, it's a story about recognizing that people aren't just patients, they're citizens. Well, they're human first and foremost, but they have citizenship, they have sovereignty, they have agency, they have self-determination, right? But also, they're members of associational life, clubs and groups and associational networks. So let's put those in there. We'll represent them as circular rather than triangular. Because when an association works well, it's not a hierarchy. Every member has to do their part. That's the nature of community. It's a pattern of co-opting each other's gifts rather than co-opting each other's needs, albeit that we recognize that we have needs as well. So what we start to do now is to recognize that at the center of all development and well-being and mental health, what we have is a story that says, let's start not just with people first, but with communities first. That it's a story that says, let's humble the institution. Let's take away this idea that development is held as a monopoly in the hands of institutions, like the World Bank or the Gates Foundation. And instead, to start the conversation where it's been started for millennia, since the beginning of humankind, which is people figuring out how to be in relationship with each other and the places they call home, or that they're migrating from or to. And then, because we're lucky to live in a liberal democracy, if you are from a liberal democracy, or because we're aspiring in some way to make sure that we have institutions that respect civil society, then we can start thinking about our institutions not as monopolies that have all of the best solutions to fixing us, but as supplementary agents of change who serve us. And what's kind of exciting about that story too, if I may call it in simple terms that, is that that's a story that's rooted, I feel, in place. So some of what I've learned over the years, I've worked in 38 countries across the world since 1996, and I've learned a hell of a lot more than I've ever shared with people or thought people. And one of the things I've learned is that place really matters. A lot of what we think of as development, and it's really been prized as worthy of the name development, has been, mile wide, inch deep. You'll often hear this, foundations, funders will only fund mental health initiatives if they can be scaled, which is actually totally in contravention with story 2. Because I think genuine human scale that respects, the context, the environment, doesn't scale. It doesn't standardize or become industrialized. I really like what you're doing in such and such a place. Could I have 500 of those tomorrow, please? And if you agree, I'll give you funding. That's a Faustian pact. It really is. You're signing a contract with the devil. Right? And I don't mean that in any religious or theological way, but metaphorically. Because most of what really works is very small, very personal, very local. Many of you are of a vintage where you'll remember that beautiful turn of phrase, small is beautiful, E.F. Schumacher. Wrote it in 1973. It's still prophetic today, actually. You know, the other thing is not far from this building, and I say this particularly for the folks that are joining us online, because the folks that are in the room would have physically navigated the physical landscape to get here. So some of you in the room may have passed the Samuel Beckett Theatre. Yeah? Or you may have been there, actually. I think some of the events are there. Well, a play that Samuel Beckett wrote, which I think is so prescient to the moment that we're in right now, was Endgame. And one of the lines from that is, "You're on Earth. There is no cure for that." And I think that was the great critique of Story 1. Because that's what Story 1 believes. Story 1 believes that there's a cure for every human ailment, including the reality, which is, ain't nobody getting off this planet alive. We are all going to die. That's the end game. We are mortal beings. We're finite. It's a terminal condition, this human condition, right? And learning to be okay with that, well, there isn't an institutional or programmatic cure for that. The only solace for that is community, actually. And understanding that is key. So I thought I'd finish with a story that brings Story 2 to life. And I'm wondering, are we joined by anybody from Belgium in the audience? No? No, okay. So this is a story that creates an interesting bridge between where we are country-wise, which is Ireland, and Belgium, and also speaks to the theme of brain health and brain week. So back in the day, this would be probably 7th, 8th century, there was a young lady by the name of Dymphna, whose father, a very respected king of Ireland, had what would be maybe described as a mental health challenge, which resulted in him trying to kill his daughter, Dymphna. So Dymphna, she fled, and she found succor or safety in a little town called Giel, or Giel, depending on how you pronounce it, in Belgium. And there she resided, and she, for various reasons, kind of entered a life of faith. And long story short, she became Saint Dymphna. And she's a patron saint of people with mental health challenges. So over the course of many, many centuries, people who would experience mental health, or what I would call overwhelm or distress, would create, I suppose, go on pilgrimages would be the language that would be used at that time. So they would engage in a pilgrimage to this town of Giel. And of course, there wasn't a lot in this town, so the people, the locals, the farmers there, would extend hospitality to people who were on pilgrimage. Now, many of the people who were on pilgrimage were looking for a cure. They were looking for healing, if you want to use that term. And so they would arrive, they would get, bed and breakfast and whatnot, and they would go and they would pray. And, that was, I guess, a version of healing. So in a sense, it was Story 1 and 2 being mixed together. Over the course of time, fast forwarding to where we are today, where we have a very secular kind of view of that. Today, if you go to the town of Giel, the remnants of that story still remain. So there are local people who are hosting guests who come to that town, not because they're coming for a service around their mental health, but because they understand that the ecology of that town is such that they've organized a way to co-create mental health as a village. It almost suggests that we don't have a mental health issue, we have a village problem, and also a village possibility. But the only way to create one is to actually build community. And so story 2 is probably best captured in the Gael story. Now, it should be said, because I did say we do need our institutions, it should be said that in that town of about 30,000 people, so it's not inconsequential in size, there are 40 district nurses who work with the families and with the associations of that town, and obviously with the individuals too. So what they're creating, I think, is a place-based ecology of care. And I think that's a really important center point on which to finish my brief sharing today, because I think what they're teaching us is, again, to go over the core principles of ABCD, is that in order to be well in mind and body, that we're soil beings, we're social beings. You know, things need to happen both within our skin and outside of our skin, and structurally. And certainly at the local level, it helps a lot if we're in a situation where people recognize that not alone our voices matter, but that we can matter through our contributions. So we have something of value. That we are connected in whatever way makes sense to us. I'm not suggesting we all go out and join a group whether we want to or not, but in ways that make sense to us, that we connect and we have a deep associational life. We know that people who are socially isolated have less protective factors when it comes to feeling well in the whole sense. But we also know that our institutions help us not by supplanting community agency and our own personal agency, but by supplementing it. And so in a sense, I think that's very hard to do if you're talking about a city or a country or you're talking about the world. But if you can get embodied in a local place and you can begin to animate the possibility there, then it becomes a whole lot easier for those places to hold the structural entities to account. And what we're seeing now, I think, is the erosion in our world today of a story that has come, and about time, has come to an end, of the strongman ruler that's going to come riding over the hill and save us. There is no cavalry coming over the hill to save our mental health or our well-being. It is kind of up to us in terms of how we organize and how we build community from the ground up, rather than waiting for the savior from the top down. Thank you.
Cormac, we have a couple of minutes. Would you be kind enough to take a few questions? If there's any out there in the bright light. How are we doing for questions?
We have a gentleman over here.
We have much. Yeah, we have to go all the way round. While people are moving from one side of the room to the other, I was struck that your organisation is called Nurture Development. And did you spend a lot of time thinking about the name?
Yes, because even though I'm cautious about the word development, I thought, well, we all develop in different ways, and so to sidestep it completely seemed not very appropriate. But the word nurture felt to me like it was a word that was less about social engineering and more about relationality. So it felt like a good fit.
Yeah, it's a lovely fit. And it echoed some of what people were talking about this morning in terms of change the language, change the process. We have a question out there.
As they say in Flemish, dank u, as they say in French, merci beaucoup. Give a good Belgian roar to the room, just a matter you're in Gael. Do you think that visiting the town of Gael where St. Dibna was martyred altered your belief in sort of the community-based care for the psychiatrically ill? Or I think Ireland does anything to learn from the community-based care of the psychiatrically ill from Netherlands or Belgium that we can bring back here to influence our sort of our philosophy of care over here in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenge for us here, and in a way it should be easier to sell this than perhaps it is the idea that just because we don't have a credential in a community context doesn't mean we can't contribute to others' mental health. And so that idea of radical hospitality, that idea that healing isn't something that's just about credentialism, is important. And I think we can learn a lot about how to foreground those non-credentialed ways of being support to each other at times of distress or overwhelm by really being careful, I think, and taking care of language. So I think when we define issues, and to respect your question 100%, and yet maybe to make a suggestion or a gentle pushback to it, I think when we call people psychiatrically ill, I think we immediately set up a scenario where we're saying that the solution is a psychiatrist. And I would contest that that language immediately puts us into a tough position if we're going to try and build community. So sometimes it's helpful, I think, to find language that drops the disorder and really foregrounds where community can take a place. Thank you. Great question.
Might there be another one out there in the light? If not, we shall keep moving. Okay, we're going to keep moving. Oh, there is. Okay.
So
see up the back. It's
we're being blinded here, so it's hard to see. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks.
Firstly, I want to say thanks for, I guess, the presentation of things as stories, because I feel like it's much more digestible. But I wonder what your definition or your understanding of development is.
So a way, in brief, to think about development is, does it come from outside in or does it come from inside out? My own feeling is that primarily if development is going to be sustainable, ideally it comes from inside out and then it's supplemented by outside support. That's the ideal. So the way I think about development, just to use images again, is like a 3-lane swimming pool. In the first lane, I see that there are things communities can do themselves if we remove the structural barriers and create space and community animation so that they can do that. That's why I love community artists who are really working hand in glove with communities. So often it's a kind of a light touch, clearing the space so that wellspring of capability emerges. The second lane of the swimming pool is where development happens with some light touch support from institutions, but it's done in a very respectful way. So we're seeing that the institutions, the professionals, the credentialed folks, hugely important, are on tap, not on top. And then I think in the third lane, there are things that we need done for us, which tend to be more led by institutions because they have the expertise, they have the research, they have the data to back it up and so forth. So I think what has been difficult for a long time is that we've had all of these disputes academically and conceptually around the first and the last lane. So there are those that are very much about mutual aid and just forget the institutions, forget the state and so forth. And I think that there's a huge naivety that goes with that. And then you have those who are very locked into the acute end of it's all about the institution and all about, top-down support. Look, the reality is all 3 lanes are needed. But the key thing to your question, what is development? I think development is recognizing that sequence matters. And if I start development in the 3rd lane, I'll very likely miss the first 2 lanes. I will eclipse, demean, overwhelm, and overshadow the uncredentialed and unevaluated capability that exists indigenously in local communities. Why? Because we don't even see what's invisible, and we don't value what has been devalued. A very simple example of this is, and I won't mention the organization I'm working with, but I'm working with an organization that purports to want to address illiteracy, or they would say positively, to promote literacy in Ghana. One of the things I asked the board of directors to consider in their process of doing that is, what is the opposite of literacy? What do you think is the opposite of literacy? It's kind of a trick question. Everybody knows it's illiteracy, but it's not. It's orality. And if you think the opposite of literacy from a development perspective is illiteracy, then from a development foundation point of view, you see illiteracy as the enemy. But what you'll do is you'll crush orality. Whereas if you start with orality and celebrate it, like we've been taught by people like Paulo Freire and so on, what you learn is that if a person is passionate about the political right to self-determination and clean wells, They will learn the writing of the word well far faster if they're politically conscientized. To me, that's development. Okay.
Lovely.
Thank you.
And so many things that you picked up from this morning about attention,
Good.
about things like Pontos La Cultura, about Augusto Boal and Paulo Freire, which will come in again on Thursday. I recommend that you spend time paying attention to Cormac Russell. Go read books, listen to him online. There is a reason he works in so many countries and has such a wealth of experience. It's been a deep joy having you here. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Pleasure.
Thank you.